Early 1944. On a routine low-level sweep, Goodson looked down and saw the kind of target pilots talked about but rarely encountered. No Brandenburg's flight line, rows of Ju-88s, W-190s, and Bf-109s parked wingtip to wingtip, completely exposed. He rolled his P-51 Mustang inverted and began a steep dive. On the ground, he appeared as a thin silver line dropping out of the sky. In the cockpit, he was already locked onto the flight line, watching the runway expand in his gun sight as the altitude unwound. Most pilots would have pulled away at 1,000 feet. Goodson kept going. At 50 feet, the Mustang skimmed the treetops. At 20 feet, its slipstream kicked up dust and grass. Then Goodson leveled the aircraft so low that ground crews later swore the propeller touched the grass. The first row of Luftwaffe aircraft filled his sight. He opened fire. 650 caliber guns sent a continuous stream of tracers across the runway. A Ju-88 ignited instantly. An Fu-190 went up seconds later. Explosions rolled down the line as fuel tanks ruptured and airframes tore apart under the concentrated fire. By the time Goodson pulled up, 12 aircraft were destroyed. Burning frames scattered across the flight line after a single pass at a height most pilots never attempted. One mechanic, still on the ground, shouted what everyone else was thinking. No Mustang can fly that low, but one had. And the pilot was James Goodson. On September 3, 1939, only hours after Britain declared war, the passenger liner SS Athenia was torpedoed by a German U-boat in the North Atlantic. Goodson, 18 years old, survived the sinking and helped haul passengers toward lifeboats in the dark. When rescue ships finally pulled him aboard, Goodson looked at his mother and said the only thing that mattered to him after the sinking, "Mom, I am joining the Air Force. I won't let this happen to people again." But the United States was still neutral. No American service would take him. So Goodson found another way. He crossed into Canada and joined the Royal Canadian Air Force, the closest path he could take into the fight. After primary training, he was sent to Britain, where he continued flying under the RAF system, waiting for his chance to get into combat. Even then, he kept telling anyone who asked he wanted to fly with Americans. So when the RAF formed the Eagle Squadrons, American volunteers flying Spitfires under British command, Goodson transferred immediately. It wasn't a safe choice. Under U.S. neutrality laws, joining a foreign combat unit could mean fines, prison, or even loss of citizenship. Goodson joined anyway. For him, the war had already started the night Athenia went down. Everything changed after December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor brought the United States fully into the conflict, and the Eagle Squadrons were later absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces. For Goodson, it wasn't the beginning of his war. It was simply the moment he could finally fight as an American pilot in an American group. He was assigned to the 4th Fighter Group, first on P-47 Thunderbolts, then on the aircraft that transformed the air war, the P-51 Mustang. The range, the Merlin engine, the stability, it was everything the 4th needed and everything Goodson had been waiting for. And once he took the Mustang down low, scraping treetops and hitting airfields at point-blank range, a new reputation followed him everywhere he went. The man who flew lower than anyone else in the 8th Air Force. When the 4th Fighter Group transitioned to the P-51 Mustang, most pilots focused on its range and its performance at altitude. Goodson looked at something else, how the aircraft behaved when it was almost touching the ground. The Mustang was designed for high-altitude escort, but down low, it became a different machine. Ground effect changed how the wings lifted. The propeller arc left only inches of margin, and any sudden gust or uneven terrain could tear a fighter apart before the pilot had time to react. Flying there required decisions made in fractions of a second. Goodson studied those limits deliberately. On missions, once the bombers were safe, he brought the Mustang down until it skimmed the treetops, testing how the aircraft settled near the deck and how early he needed to commit to a pull-up to clear a fence, a barn, or a concealed flak position. The risks were constant. Light flak that could shred a wing, hidden gun pits, telephone wires nearly invisible at 350 miles an hour. But the more he flew at low level, the more precisely he understood what the Mustang could and couldn't do. Ground crews often found grass stuck in the radiator scoop, leaves plastered across the belly, and occasionally scorch marks from flying over burning targets. Goodson wasn't showing off. He was learning the airplane in a way few others attempted. Part of why he could do this came from the way the United States trained its pilots. The USAAF emphasized initiative and pilot judgment. Trainees practiced contour flying, skip bombing patterns, and live-fire strafing runs. None of this was special instruction. It was standard American training. Pilots graduated with 250 to 300 flying hours, far more than new German pilots, who averaged around 110 hours, or Japanese pilots, who sometimes entered combat with barely 40. By the time Goodson reached England, he already had a foundation built for fast decisions and low-altitude maneuvering. This didn't make every American pilot a low-level expert, but it created the environment where someone like Goodson could develop. By early 1944, his low-level attacks had become part of the 4th Fighter Group's identity. On one mission, he and a wingman hit a Luftwaffe base so hard that German intelligence reported it as a multi-squadron raid. On another, he flew so low over a pond that water spray covered the canopy. Pilots who saw him escape an FW-190 remembered him dropping beneath the German fighter and threading the Mustang through the gap between a barn and a hedgerow at full power. Every time he returned from a mission, mechanics expected to see something unusual: scratches along the belly, dents on the leading edges, or tiny nicks on the propeller tips from flying lower than procedures allowed. His commanders tried repeatedly to rein him in, arguing that he was too valuable to risk on ground attacks. Goodson ignored the warnings. He believed that hitting Luftwaffe airfields directly saved bomber crews, and he flew according to that belief. German ground units eventually filed reports describing a Mustang flying lower than aerodynamics should allow. Why knowed, any dad. Inside the 4th Fighter Group, his nickname stopped being an exaggeration and simply became an accurate description of his role: King of the Straffers. By mid-1944, Goodson was recognized by both friend and foe for exactly what he had become: one of the most aggressive and effective low-level attackers the U.S. ever put into the European sky. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing aircraft faster than it could replace them, and many German airfields had become storage lots, rows of fighters and bombers parked wingtip to wingtip, waiting for fuel, parts, or trained crews. Neubrandenburg was one of those fields. From altitude, it looked almost static: long lines of Ju-88s, Bf-109s, and trainer aircraft arranged neatly along the runways, with ground crews moving between them at an unhurried pace. When Goodson's flight reached the area, he spotted the layout immediately. The aircraft were packed so closely together that a single strafing run could ignite a chain reaction. It was the kind of target U.S. pilots called jammed, a rare chance to destroy more enemy aircraft on the ground in seconds than many would shoot down in the air during their entire tour. Most Mustang pilots avoided such attacks. There was a reason for it. P-47 Thunderbolts, with their rugged, radial engines and heavier armor, were considered the proper tool for low-level strikes. The P-51's liquid-cooled Merlin engine was far more vulnerable. A single hit to the cooling system meant an instant, fatal failure. German crews on the ground knew this, and many believed the P-51 could not operate safely at very low altitude. Goodson had no interest in confirming their assumptions. From his position above the field, he saw the rows of aircraft, the open approach path, and the absence of heavy flak. The opportunity was clear, and the decision came quickly. He rolled the Mustang over and pointed the nose straight at the airfield. Other pilots might have circled, climbed for a safer angle, or passed the target to the Thunderbolts. Goodson didn't. He committed to the dive. A direct low-level pass, exactly the kind of attack most P-51 pilots avoided. The Mustang accelerated hard in the dive, the Merlin engine howling as the altimeter unwound. 5,000 feet, 3,000, 1,000. The aircraft vibrated as the air thickened around it, and the ground expanded across the canopy like a rising wall. Goodson kept the stick steady, letting the dive stabilize naturally rather than forcing it. At 50 feet, he was already lower than standard attack profiles. He kept going. The Mustang leveled out at roughly 10 feet, low enough that the propeller wash kicked dust and grass behind him in a continuous trail. At that altitude, any mistake was final. There was no time to correct, no altitude to trade, and no margin for misjudgment. But the aircraft stayed firm, exactly where Goodson wanted it. The first row of German aircraft filled the gun sight. Goodson squeezed the trigger. All 6 50-caliber machine guns opened at once, producing a solid horizontal stream of fire that cut across the runway like a moving blade. A Ju-88 erupted almost instantly, flames blasting upward as fragments spun into neighboring aircraft. An FD-190 caught fire next, then another aircraft down the line as the burning wreckage set off sympathetic explosions. The packed formation turned the entire flight line into a continuous chain of detonations. Goodson held the run straight, letting the line of destruction develop on its own. Fuel tanks burst, wings folded, engines tore free. Within seconds, the entire left side of the airfield was a rolling sheet of fire and smoke. By the time Goodson pulled up, aircraft across the flight line were burning, frames collapsing, fuel tanks rupturing, wreckage scattered end to end. The single pass shattered the airfield. On the ground, German mechanics and guards were certain they were under attack by multiple American squadrons. Their reports described a large force of Mustangs sweeping the airfield. Only later did they learn the truth. The destruction had come from one aircraft, a lone P-51 flying at a height they believed impossible. By June 1944, the 4th Fighter Group was flying deep into Germany almost daily. Strafing runs were constant, and the Luftwaffe had strengthened its flak defenses around every major airfield. On June 20th, Goodson led another low-level attack. As he pulled out of his run, a 20mm burst hit the nose of his Mustang. Oil flooded the canopy. The Merlin quit, and he had no altitude left to work with. He bailed out over forest. He hit the trees hard and tore his leg open. German search teams were already moving, so he dragged himself deeper into cover and began the only fight left, staying ahead of the patrols. For 8 days, he crawled through underbrush, drank from puddles, lived on snails and field mice, and stayed silent whenever he heard voices. Search teams passed close, sometimes only yards away. By the 8th day, he was barely conscious. A local search party found him lying in a thicket and pulled him out into a clearing. In that region, in that summer, downed strafers were usually shot where they were found. But Goodson survived for one ridiculous reason. He asked for a cigarette and ended up teaching the Germans how to blow a smoke ring. The moment threw them off balance. Rifles lowered. The execution never happened. Instead of being shot, Goodson was marched out of the forest and processed as a prisoner of war. Goodson was moved through several holding points before reaching Stalag Luft 3, the same camp that had seen the Great Escape only months earlier. By the time he arrived, security was tighter, rations were low, and daily life had settled into the dull routine familiar to most Allied airmen held in Germany. He walked with a limp, but he adapted quickly. POW life was repetition, roll calls, Red Cross parcels, long periods of waiting, and the constant hope of news from outside. Among the prisoners, Goodson was known less for his injuries and more for the stories he told, calm, matter-of-fact accounts of flying Mustangs over Europe. Then, in early 1945, the front collapsed. As Soviet forces advanced from the east, the Germans evacuated the camp. What followed became known as the Long March, hundreds of miles on foot through snow, ice, and near starvation. Men collapsed along the road. Some froze overnight. Goodson pushed through the march with the same stubbornness that had kept him alive in the forest. He eventually reached Stalag 7A in Moosburg, a massively overcrowded camp filled with prisoners from every branch of the Allied forces. Conditions were harsh, but by then, Goodson understood how to survive captivity. On April 29, 1945, American tanks of the 14th Armored Division broke through the perimeter. Guards surrendered. Thousands of POWs surged toward the gates. Goodson, thinner than he had ever been and still limping from his June wound, walked out of the camp and back into Allied hands. His war had lasted 6 years, from the Athenia's sinking in 1939 to the liberation of Moosburg in 1945. When the records were finally tallied, Goodson stood among the most decorated American fighter pilots of the European War. 22 medals from both the United States and Britain. But for him, the legacy wasn't the decorations. It was the men he flew with, the missions he survived, and the simple fact that he had come home. James Goodson lived quietly after the war, corporate work, reunions, and eventually the memoir Tumult in the Clouds, now considered one of the finest personal accounts of the air war in Europe. He passed away in 2014 at the age of 93.